was not alarmed. He said he was just chilling, like nothing was weird.
What is the point?
The video been viewed more than 1 million times. Highway Patrol has not identified the people involved, but they point out this could have ended tragically. So obviously, folks, don't try this at home.
He's going to get the Darwin Award.
Why do people do things like
Well, what happened was a duck had touched him, and the family in the car wouldn't allow him back in the car. All right, I haven't banned a phrase in a while. Let's ban this one.
Yeah, you ruined everyone's one more thing.
Yes, I'm trying my best. Now more than ever. You see this in headlines. We need Jimmy Carter now more than ever. We need Barry Manilow now more than ever.
Barack Obama.
No, we need to stop repeating now more than ever, now more than ever. How's that one?
It's a pretty good one.
All right, that gives Jesse
Do you have anything
30
to promote?
seconds.
Well, Greg disparaged my one more thing. He called it clickbait, so I pulled it. I'm not going to do it in the spirit of civility. I will mention yesterday on the show I said Barack Obama was the worst president since World War II. It turns out he's the second worst president. Probably the only mistake I've ever made on the show.
Who was the worst?
Man enough to say it. And no one even told me I had to say it. I just said it.
Yeah,
Very
because
good.
you're a
Nice
gentle
correction.
soul.
All right.
But are you sorry?
Like you care, and you should. It's Bret Baier. Looking good.
Oh, that was
Thanks,
good
Greg.
one.
Now more than
Yesterday's
ever.
wasn't good.
The U.S. Supreme Court hands President Trump a major victory, upholding his travel ban. The second day of stories about incivility in Washington after the White House press secretary is booted from a Virginia restaurant. And primary day features an ex-con hoping to get back to Congress and a former presidential nominee aiming at the U.S. Senate. This is Special Report. Good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Bret Baier. We begin tonight with a huge win for President Trump. The U.S. Supreme Court has let stand the president's travel ban on people from 5 mostly Muslim countries and 2 others. The White House had framed the rule as crucial for national security. Opponents called it religious discrimination. My colleague and anchor of Fox News at Night, Shannon Bream, is at the Supreme Court, where she's been all day, with what happened and why, along with the implications going forward. Good evening, Shannon.
Hello, Brett. Well, the majority made clear today that the president was well within his powers under the law to set the conditions for people who want to come to this country. It's a victory for them today, but this case is actually not over.
No ban! No wall! No ban! No wall!
After more than a year of legal wrangling, losses in the lower courts, and 3 different versions, the president's so-called travel ban has been upheld in a 5-4 opinion by the U.S. Supreme Court. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice Roberts said, quote, "By its plain language, federal law grants the president broad discretion to suspend the entry of aliens into the United States. The president lawfully exercised that discretion based on his findings following a worldwide multi-agency review that entry of the covered aliens would be detrimental to the national interest."
What we're doing is looking at countries in a rational way. I defy anybody to tell me that any of the countries named that the government is in control, that the vetting process works, and terrorism is not a problem.
What the majority didn't do was look to the various statements President Trump made as both a candidate and newly sworn-in commander-in-chief to decide whether the ban was motivated by religious animus. The Chief Justice again, quote, "The proclamation is expressly premised on legitimate purposes. The text says nothing about religion." But in one of 2 passionate dissents, Justice Sotomayor blasted the majority for not looking to Mr. Trump's statements. Quote, "Based on the evidence in the record, a reasonable observer would conclude that the proclamation was motivated by anti-Muslim animus. The majority holds otherwise by ignoring the facts, misconstruing our legal precedent, and turning a blind eye to the pain and suffering the proclamation inflicts upon countless families and individuals."
This is really a sad day for America. Make no mistake, the Supreme Court has endorsed bigotry and Islamophobia.
The majority and dissent also sparred over comparisons to Korematsu, a 1944 ruling upholding a presidential directive ordering Japanese Americans into internment camps in World War II. Justice Sotomayor claiming the majority's reasoning today paralleled that decision from more than 7 decades ago, writing, "In Korematsu, the court gave a pass to an odious, gravely injurious racial classification authorized by an executive order." The Chief Justice explicitly rejected the comparison, quote, "Whatever rhetorical advantage the dissent may see in doing so, Korematsu has nothing to do with this case. It is wholly inapt to liken that morally repugnant order to a facially neutral policy denying certain foreign nationals the privilege of admission."
There you go.
And the case doesn't end here because the Supreme Court was specifically ruling on whether or not an injunction against the travel ban 3.0 could stand. So now today, with this guidance from the justices, it goes back to the lower court for a decision actually on the merits. Bret?
Jen, there was also another ruling today regarding crisis pregnancy centers in California. How did that pan out?
Well, the state there passed a law that it managed to scoop up all the pro-life pregnancy centers, almost all of them in the state, essentially telling them that they had to provide all kinds of information to potential clients, including about where they could find abortions and access them. Well, these clinics sued, saying that violates their free speech rights, and said it's actually antithetical to the mission that they have, which is to encourage women to carry their pregnancies to term. It was a 5-4 decision written by Clarence Thomas. He essentially found that it's a good chance these clinics are going to prevail on the merits, so he sent back the case to California for them to deal with it. Bret?
Still waiting on one more?
We are. Tomorrow we're waiting on a big case involving whether or not public sector employees can be forced to pay fees or dues into a union whose political messages they don't agree with. It could impact millions of people across the country. We'll get it at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Another big day. Shannon Bream outside the court. Shannon, thanks. President Trump's initial reaction to the U.S. Supreme Court decision today on Twitter, one word: wow. He had much more to say later. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts has that part of the story.
Today's Supreme Court ruling just coming out, a tremendous success, a tremendous victory for the American people and for our Constitution.
In the cabinet room with Republican members of Congress today, President Trump with praise for the Supreme Court decision on his travel ban.
We have to be tough, and we have to be safe, and we have to be secure. At a minimum, we have to make sure that we vet people coming into the country. We know who's coming in. We know where they're coming from.
The ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee disagreed with the president and the majority opinion. In a statement, Senator Dick Durbin saying history will not be kind to this president's policies or the Supreme Court justices who lent their names to this troubling ruling. Though the Supreme sent the case back to the lower courts for further proceedings, President Trump considers the matter settled.
Do you consider that the final word, sir? Well, I think it's pretty much a final word. It's Supreme Court. You know, we went up and we'd win it, we'd lose it. We just waited for the Supreme Court. Yeah, that's the final word.
The decision put some much-needed wind in the president's sails. He has been battered by public outcry over the separation of families at the border, his aides hounded at restaurants and their homes. Today, he doubled down on his calls for Congress to give him what he wants to secure the southern border.
We have to change it. It's so simple. It's called, I'm sorry, you can't come in. You have to go in through a legal process. You don't have to see a judge where the judge is going to take 3 years before you can come back. In the meantime, you never come back because you're already in the country.
As he keeps up the pressure on illegal immigration, President Trump also took aim today at an American icon.
Boy, would you like to see me fall off.
A year ago, he was praising Harley-Davidson for building its bikes in the USA. Today, he ripped them for plans to shift some production to Thailand. The president tweeting, a Harley-Davidson should never be built in another country. Never. If they move, watch. It will be the beginning of the end. They surrendered. They quit. The aura will be gone, and they will be taxed like never before. Harley-Davidson says it was the threat of retaliation to the president's trade tariffs that forced the move, and that only Harleys to be sold in Europe are affected. President Trump today insisted it had nothing to do with tariffs.
They announced it early this year, so Harley-Davidson is using that as an excuse, and I don't like that because I've been very good to Harley-Davidson, and they used it as an excuse, and I think the people that ride Harleys are not happy with Harley-Davidson, and I wouldn't be either.
Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, who shares a home state with Harley-Davidson, says he's no fan of tariffs.
I don't think tariffs are the right way to go. I think tariffs are basically taxes. And what ends up happening is you get escalating tariffs or escalating taxes.
On immigration, White House officials tell me they expect that the measure that should be before the House tomorrow likely won't go anywhere, so the next move would likely be a narrowly tailored bill to supersede the 1997 court settlement that only allows children to be held in detention with their parents for a period of 20 days. Officials say it's far less than what the president has been asking for, but a lot better than what will happen if DHS and the Border Patrol start separating families again. Bret?
John Roberts live on the North Lawn. John, thank you. 17 states are suing the Trump administration to force it to reunite thousands of immigrant children and parents separated at the border. The states are all led by Democratic attorneys general. They join Washington, D.C. in filing the lawsuit in federal court in Seattle. The Justice Department did not immediately respond to a request for comment on this multi-state lawsuit. The restaurant, whose owner asked the president's press secretary to leave over the weekend, will remain closed for several more days. That owner has also now just resigned from a local business organization there. Meanwhile, many in the small Northern Virginia community fear their business may now suffer. Correspondent Doug McKelway is in Lexington again tonight.
Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee are both buried in Lexington, Virginia. Reminders that some civil wars are not as soft as the one Lexington is experiencing today. Numerous shop owners refuse to talk to us about the Red Hen controversy, wary that if you take a side, you risk alienating half your customers.
It's very painful for me what's happening in this country. The meanness, and I'm sorry, I'm liberal, but I'm not happy with those that are mouthing off on either side.
I hope you're not only just talking to the people that supported this woman. What she did is really embarrassment to all of us.
The Red Hen's owner, Stephanie Wilkinson, was also until today the executive chair of an influential business group here, Main Street, Lexington. She resigned from that post this afternoon, according to published reports.
After Sarah and her husband left and the family relocated to a restaurant across the street, the owner of the Red Hen then organized an effort to go and scream at them from the sidewalk at the other restaurant.
Huckabee's story confirmed by the man who hosted the Sanders family at his bed and breakfast.
It was just an unfortunate situation, because I guess, again, if you're trying to make a statement, make the statement. Don't keep screaming it, and follow people or what have you.
200 miles to the north, a congressman who was nearly killed by a gunman with extremist views knows how far such incivility can go.
I know firsthand, we've got to be real careful about how we discuss our differences. The great part of America is that we can discuss our differences freely and openly, but we also have a responsibility to make sure that we're not trying to incite others to violence.
More Democrats are joining Senate Minority Leader Schumer's call for civility. A spokesman for Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine told the Richmond Times-Dispatch that he, quote, believes in civility and respect from everyone are important to a functioning democracy. We're told that the Red Hen restaurant, which had been scheduled to reopen at 5 o'clock this afternoon, will now remain closed until July 5th. And for the first time, as you can see, we are seeing protests here today. They're winding down right now. Only one arrest thus far. A Donald Trump supporter threw a bucket of chicken manure in the direction of the building. He was promptly arrested. Brett?
Doug McKelway in Lexington, Virginia. Doug, thanks. The president is anointing Maxine Waters as the face of the Democrats. And many of Waters' Democratic colleagues are critical of her comments as well. Yet several prominent liberal commentators believe there is nothing wrong with harassing political opponents. Tonight, Fox News media analyst and host of Fox's Media Buzz, Howard Kurtz, puts all of this situation in context.
When word spread that a Virginia restaurant had refused to serve Sarah Huckabee Sanders, some pundits, those who detest President Trump, started cheering. The press secretary, they said, deserved the rude treatment.
You'll make choices in life, and there is a cost to being an accomplice to this cruel, deceitful administration.
The defining feature of a free society is that you can tell one of the most powerful people in the world in your government, get out of my restaurant.
MSNBC contributor and Washington Post columnist Jennifer Rubin says Trump officials should become social pariahs of sorts. Most conservative commentators denounced the Sanders incident. And protesters confronting other Trump aides, especially after Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters called for their continued harassment.
Shouting each other down, kicking our political enemies out of restaurants, heckling them in public may feel good in the moment, but it isn't a solution.
Threatening women and children. What is wrong with you people on the left?
Former Obama White House aide David Axelrod drew criticism from Democrats for taking Sanders' side, writing, kind of amazed and appalled by the number of folks on left who applauded the expulsion of press secretary and her family from a restaurant.
Trump opponents are using the president's previous policy of family separations at the border to justify their in-your-face tactics. And the president's critics point to his rough language and personal insults, as in these clips from MSNBC's Morning Joe.
If you see somebody getting ready to throw a tomato, knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously. I'd like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you.
But if Obama administration officials had been harassed in similar fashion, it's not hard to imagine both liberals and conservatives switching sides. The tribal warfare over the hounding of Trump aides is magnified by a polarized media environment and the toxic nature of social media. All this has produced a vicious cycle that could well spiral out of control. Bret?
Let's hope not. Howie, thanks. Up next, Iranians blame their government while their government blames the U.S. We'll tell you what the problem is and take you there. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 40 in Sacramento, where California voters will decide this November whether to get rid of high gasoline taxes and vehicle registration fees that they approved last year. The Secretary of State announced Monday initiative supporters have collected enough valid signatures to qualify for the ballot there. Fox 2 in Honolulu, where the governor says he is considering opening up a new area for people to view the lava on Hawaii Island. The governor says a new viewing area would have the potential to pump money back into the island's economy. The Kilauea volcano has been exploding and erupting, as we've reported, sending out ash and lava since early May. And this is a live look at Atlanta from our affiliate Fox 5. The big story there tonight, a woman accused of leaking U.S. secrets to a news outlet pleads guilty in federal court. Reality Winner reached a plea agreement with prosecutors calling for her to serve 5 years and 3 months behind bars. She is an NSA contractor charged with copying a classified report and mailing it to an unidentified news organization. That's tonight's live look. Outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. Iran's president says the U.S. is trying to damage his country by creating an economic war. Iranians seem to be blaming their government, not America, for a financial situation growing worse by the day. Correspondent Connor Powell takes a look from our Middle East newsroom.
For the third day in a row, much of Tehran's Grand Bazaar was closed as its merchants took to the streets demanding economic reforms. The protests erupted after Iran's currency, the rial, plummeted in recent days, while the price of consumer goods have skyrocketed. Security forces tried to stop the demonstrations, with clashes breaking out. Protests have spread to other cities, but it isn't clear how large or widespread they actually are. In a televised speech today, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani defended his government's economic policies and said Iran will be able to handle the economic pressure from new U.S. sanctions, which he said are part of a psychological, economic, and political war, adding that the Trump administration will fail to defeat Iran.
As always, America wants to break apart the power and glory of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In May, President Trump pulled America out of the Iran nuclear deal, and U.S. sanctions are set to be reinstituted in August, potentially depriving Tehran of millions of dollars in trade at a time when its economy is already stretched thin. Economic protests in Iran are common. This past winter, similar demonstrations swept across the country. But so far, their focus has largely been limited to demands of ending corruption and reforming the government, not overthrowing it. In Iran, President Rouhani is seen as a reformer, but he's coming under intense pressure from both hardliners who think he's gone too far and moderates who think he hasn't gone far enough. Bret?
Connor Powell in our Middle East newsroom. Connor, thank you. Prince William is in Israel right now. It is the first ever, as hard as this is to believe, it's the first ever official visit by a member of the British royal family to the tumultuous region. William took a tour of a Holocaust memorial and attended a soccer match between Arab and Jewish youth. The prince also met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Back in London, a London court has granted ride-hailing firm Uber permission to keep driving on the streets of London. Last year, a regulator refused to renew Uber's operating license over public safety concerns. Uber says it has overhauled its policies and personnel, and today the city's regulator agreed and granted a probationary license. President Trump has a warning for America's allies. He is once again hinting at a radical change in the way the U.S. supports NATO. Correspondent Kevin Corke has more on that from the White House.
Germany is paying 1% of a much smaller GDP. We're paying close to 4% of a much larger GDP. So I think we should pay the same as Germany.
To the denizens of the Palmetto State, it was music to the ears. President Trump talking tough about NATO, calling out Germany for what he says is its lack of financial commitment to the alliance and suggesting now may be the time for the U.S. to pull the purse strings.
It's all wonderful and we like to help out, but it helps them. They're in Europe.
The president's critique that members aren't doing enough to fund their own security is not new. He slammed the alliance on Twitter, warning that change is coming, a message sharply delivered to NATO defense ministers in Brussels and received loud and clear at the White House.
More and more allies are at 2% of GDP for defense. But I also agree that we have to do more.
NATO has 29 member states, but only 8 countries, including the U.S., spend the agreed-to 2% of GDP on NATO. In fact, at 3.5% of its GDP, the U.S. accounts for 22% of NATO's total budget. Many of America's largest partners, like Germany, fall well short, prompting the president's threat to match their spending levels. Senior administration officials say the president's rhetorical pressure isn't likely to be backed up with immediate policy changes, but the risk for the alliance is all too real, particularly for European capitals who've watched warily as Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea.
In 2018, when the numbers are finished, we'll have the largest increase in defense spending by our NATO countries outside of the United States since the Cold War.
The rhetorical pressure by the president is seen by some as a proxy issue for what he considers unfair European trade practices, something which will get a great deal of attention at next month's NATO summit in Brussels. Brett?
Kevin Corke at the White House. Kevin, thank you. Stocks were mostly up today, modestly, I should say. The Dow gained 30. The S&P 500 finished ahead 6. The Nasdaq rebounded 30. The Congressional Budget Office says federal debt compared to the size of the economy will reach 78% this fiscal year. That is the highest level in nearly 7 decades. The CBO says it will grow sharply from there over the next 3 decades. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer cited that report to criticize tax cuts that went into effect this year. Republicans say those cuts were necessary for the U.S. economy to grow. Up next, it is a big primary day, and several states will go live to South Carolina and Utah. In America's election headquarters tonight, primary day. Voters in 7 states are participating today. In New York, former Congressman and convicted felon Michael Grimm tries to get hold of his old congressional seat back in the Republican Party there. Democrats in 2 states are selecting their fall nominees for governor. In Colorado, candidates are seeking to replace term-limited Democrat John Hickenlooper. In Maryland, former NAACP President Ben Jealous is one of the candidates looking to take on incumbent Republican Larry Hogan in November. And then there's Utah, where a former presidential nominee is looking at a new path to try to get to Washington. Correspondent Dan Springer is in Provo tonight.
On the eve of the Republican primary in Utah, former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney was still campaigning hard just outside Provo. 6 years after losing his bid for the presidency, Romney is hoping to take a big step today toward another job in Washington, the U.S. Senate. And the latest poll says he's a virtual shoo-in, with a 42-point lead over his primary opponent, Mike Kennedy. It's got Romney finally agreeing to do national interviews, where the big question is, how would a Senator Romney deal with President Trump?
If I get to Washington, I will work with him and with the policies I think are right. I will oppose those things I think are wrong for the country or for the state, and I'll speak my mind on issues of conscience.
Romney says there would be no return to the bomb-throwing days of 2016 when he was the face of the Never Trump movement.
Donald Trump is a phony, a fraud. His promises are as worthless as a degree from Trump University.
He was begging for my endorsement.
I could have said, Mitt, drop to your knees. He would have dropped to his knees.
But after Trump was elected, both men stood down, and Romney even interviewed to be Secretary of State. While the relationship thawed, President Trump seemed to take a swipe at Romney when he strongly urged Orrin Hatch to stay in the Senate. But then in February, he surprised some by tweeting his endorsement of Romney. Romney says he's not ready to endorse President Trump for re-election, but recently did predict he'll win because of the economy. The Senate candidate also said Trump is no role model for children, but insists he will not try to influence the White House.
Two separate branches. My job is to try and get things through the legislative branch that are right for the country. I'm not going to try and manage the White House or how the president interacts with others. That's up to him and his administration and his team.
If Mitt Romney wins tonight, as is widely expected, he'll take on Democrat Jenny Wilson, who is a current city council member in Salt Lake City and also the daughter of a longtime mayor there. Just to show you the challenge that lies ahead for her, when Romney ran for president, he won Utah. Utah voters gave him a 48-point victory here.
Dan Springer in Provo. Dan, thanks. In the South Carolina primary on the other side of the country, the Republican governor is trying to hold off a hard-charging businessman who was a complete unknown in the state 6 months ago. And he's getting some help. Correspondent Jonathan Seri looks at that race tonight from Columbia.
Good morning. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster cast his ballot this morning in Columbia, while challenger John Warren voted in Greenville. Both candidates in South Carolina's GOP runoff for governor call themselves Trump conservatives, but it was McMaster the president came to stump for.
Right from day one, when I came down here, Henry McMaster, I said, so why are you with me? He said, because I like what you're saying.
Returning a favor to one of his earliest supporters, Mr. Trump rallied a packed room at a McMaster event. Many in the MAGA hat-wearing crowd were there to see the president more than the candidate, and Warren hopes many of them will vote for him.
Donald Trump has a ton of support in South Carolina. A lot of my supporters are his supporters. This is not a referendum on President Trump. This is a referendum on Henry McMaster's failed leadership and my vision of conservative reform throughout our state.
Warren, a Greenville businessman and combat vet, is touting his status as a political newcomer, promising to drain the swamp in the state capital. Coming from South Carolina's socially conservative upstate region may help Warren in a primary race in which abortion is played front and center. But McMaster, who rose to the governorship after Nikki Haley joined the Trump administration as UN ambassador, has been touting the businesses and jobs that have moved into his state during his brief tenure as governor.
We got a great team. It goes from the White House to the State House to your house, and the people in South Carolina know that we're on the way up. Things are getting better, and we want to keep this team together.
The winner of tonight's GOP primary runoff will face Democrat James Smith in the November general election. Smith, who's both a lawyer and a state representative, hopes that his experience as a combat vet will have broad appeal in this strongly pro-military state. The polls close in about half an hour. Bret?
We'll watch that. All the results here on Fox. Jonathan, thank you. Meantime, please join us Thursday night for a special event. We will have a debate between the top two candidates for Florida governor. We'll be live from Orlando, 6:30 p.m. Eastern. Well, special report at 6. Debate starts at 6:30, hosted by Martha McCallum and yours truly. And then the story continues after the debate, much like we did in Virginia. Should be a good one Thursday night. The U.S. Supreme Court hands President Trump a big win over his travel ban. We'll get reaction from the panel and maybe what comes next when we come back.
The Supreme Court ruling was a tremendous victory for our country. We have to be tough, and we have to be safe, and we have to be secure.
This is a moral moment for our nation. We're a president who openly wants to put a religious test on citizenship.
This is not a religious ban. You're picking out countries with high threat levels, with a poor vetting process, so it makes sense, and I think this ruling makes us safer.
Well, today the Supreme Court handing President Trump and his administration a big win, upholding travel ban 3.0, 5-4 decision. The majority, you see the justices voting in the majority there, and the dissenting, the opinion on the majority saying, quote, the proclamation is squarely within the scope of presidential authority under federal law. Indeed, neither dissent even attempts any serious argument to the contrary. The dissent, written by Justice Sotomayor, says, quote, this repackaging does little to cleanse presidential proclamation number 9645 of the appearance of discrimination that the president's words have created. Based on the evidence in the record, a reasonable observer would conclude that the proclamation was motivated by anti-Muslim animus. With that, let's bring in our panel. Byron York, chief political correspondent of the Washington Examiner, Molly Hemingway, senior editor at the Federalist, and Charles Lane, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Okay, Byron, significant ruling today?
It was. This was all we were talking about in the first few months of the Trump administration, and it should have been a slam dunk for the White House. And the fact that it was not is really amazing. John Roberts is correct. It was clearly within the scope of the president's constitutional powers. And the biggest argument against it was that even though it was a legitimate presidential power, that this president, Donald Trump, had exercised it with impure motive. And you had a situation in which an executive order, word for word, if signed by another president, would have been constitutional. And yet, since it was signed by Donald Trump with his history of anti-Muslim statements, it was therefore unconstitutional. That would have been a crazy legal area to go into in the court. It's a relief, really, that the court did not do that.
Molly.
And Chief Justice Roberts specifically addressed the issue of whether it was a religious test or not, pointing out that it covered only 8% of the world's Muslims, that it was using a list that had been developed by a previous administration, the Obama administration.
Let's put up the map while she's talking there.
And that it also included North Korea and Venezuela, so that it was hard to argue that this was, even though this is what the conversation had been in the media, that this was a Muslim ban, and even Donald Trump referred to it as that. It really is an important decision dealing with whether the executive has the authority to make decisions about national security related to immigration. And it's important also to consider how the Obama administration fared with the Supreme Court when it tested executive authority. It repeatedly was turned away by the court, sometimes by 9-0 decisions. So this is something that I think is the Trump administration can legitimately be pleased with on the question of executive authority.
Interesting reaction from all over Capitol Hill and elsewhere. Here's one commentator on another channel with an interesting analogy.
What Osama bin Laden hoped to provoke was a war of civilization, a war between the West and 1 billion Muslims. And so what Donald Trump and this Muslim ban signal to the world is that Muslims are not welcome here. That this is, whether the conservative justices say that in fact this is about executive power, the president's clear intent was to impose a religious test. And that is as fundamentally un-American as anything that he's done over the course of this presidency.
Now, what about the majority opinion that was looking at the words on the paper there?
Well, you know, I would like to just react to that in tandem with reacting to Byron. Byron's absolutely right. If you just took the, let's say, the 3.0 version of this, not the first two, which were quite different, the biggest problem was the problem the president created for himself through all this extravagant and hostile rhetoric toward Muslims. George W. Bush, of course, who was president right after 9/11, went out of his way to signal that the United States did not have a quarrel with all Muslims, just the Islamist terrorists. And so I think that commentator you just put up there has a point that the atmospherics around this were terrible. One of the lessons of this decision, though, is not everything that has terrible atmospherics, that's perhaps even stupid and offensive, is unconstitutional. Or even in this case, because there was a statutory argument against it, against the statutes either. I don't consider this so much a victory or even a vindication, which is the president's other word for this. I think what he got from the Supreme Court today was a rather a grudging almost acknowledgement that, okay, you can do this if you insist. There's no rhetoric in that any of the majority or concurring opinions saying, yeah, this was absolutely necessary, et cetera. It was like, well, you know, we can't stop you. We have no basis to stop you, so you can go ahead.
But at its heart, Molly, was an increase in this 3.0 version of the stipulations to get in, what these countries were doing to vet the people who were actually getting to the U.S. Chad was on the list, but then taken off because they met the stipulations.
Right, so it's hard to argue that it was some arbitrary list. And in fact, I think the first version of the ban actually would have held up under the decision-making that the court had today. Another issue where atmospherics was bad, though, is that you had a district court doing an injunction against a national ruling. And this is a trend that we're seeing a lot, particularly during the Trump administration, where district courts are thwarting national issues. And Clarence Thomas specifically said in his concurring opinion that this is something that might have to be taken up soon to discuss the legality of it. The fact that this was a 5-4 decision is also significant because it means that we're getting very narrow decisions based on, on highly political cases. It is a tremendous argument in favor of those people who did vote for Donald Trump, that they were able to get a 5-4 decision on this, and also the decision that forbids the state of California from forcing pro-life groups to advocate for abortion. But the fact that they're 5-4 decisions means that we're going to see this court continue to be a very political issue.
It shows also how important being able to have a nominee that becomes a Supreme Court justice is in this political world that we live.
If Donald Trump ever says anything bad about Mitch McConnell again, he shouldn't. He will, I'm sure, but he shouldn't. But look at some of the precedents that could have happened if this had gone the other way. The shackles that could have been put on a future president's ability to act in national security instances, and also it seemed to want to create some of the opponents of the ban with foreign nationals physically outside the United States, seem to create some sort of constitutional right of entry into the United States. And that would have been a terrible precedent.
Our late friend Charles Krauthammer weighed in on this last year.
I'm not against tightening the vetting. We should. But I think what we're seeing is the kind of kabuki that we do as a way to make ourselves think that we are safer from terrorism. There are a lot of sources of terrorism. Of the whole list, probably at the bottom, is the idea of infiltration from these states. These are 7 states in 15 years since 9/11. There hasn't been a single murder of an American by a national of these countries.
Chuck.
Well, that's another good point, is that quite a few of the recent lone wolf attacks have taken place by people who were either born in the United States or who were here on green cards, and the relationship between terrorism in these particular countries, though not completely disjointed, is a little tenuous. It's just that I think what the court was wrestling with, particularly Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kennedy, do we take this power away from all future presidents because we're so uncertain about the trustworthiness of the current one? And I think they felt we're going to have to swallow this exercise of the power in the case of a very, very inflammatory president, because it could be used legitimately when the presidency is occupied by a different person later on.
Look at the circuit courts that were willing to do that. Not just the Ninth Circuit, the Fourth Circuit, all the judges short of the Supreme Court, big majorities were willing to do that with the president.
And some of them will be changed because as the judges get through the process up on Capitol Hill. Yep. Including the Ninth Circuit. Next up, the president takes on Harley Davidson and tariffs.
So thank you, Harley Davidson, for building things in America. I don't like that because I've been very good to Harley Davidson, and they used it as an excuse. And I think the people that ride Harleys are not happy with Harley Davidson, and I wouldn't be either.
I'm actually on Harley Davidson's side. I don't think these tariffs are beneficial to anybody in any business in America. And I'm very concerned about it. I'm a strong supporter of the president, but I think he's wrong on that.
A tariff war only ends up hurting the middle class in higher prices and in the loss of jobs. Harley Davidson will be an example of that. They follow through, or instead of manufacturing here, they'll manufacture abroad. That doesn't help America, make America greater.
Harley Davidson moving some of its production over to Thailand to sell to Europe, they say, because of the tariffs, is what Harley Davidson said. The president said they made that decision before the tariffs were announced. He had a series of tweets and comments you just saw back with the panel. Molly.
Tariffs are generally to be avoided because they introduce inefficiencies to the market and they're attacks on consumers. But politicians use them because sometimes they work. And Ronald Reagan actually imposed a tariff against all non-Harley motorcycles in the early 1980s. And that did play a role in Harley escaping from bankruptcy. And the EU imposed high tariffs in response to our tariff increase, which happened after their high tariffs. And Harley is saying that they are responding to these tariffs, although it is true that they had previously announced these plans with regard to Thailand. It is important to remember that Harley has had a very rough 4 years. They have had declining profits. They've been losing market share, and this is also something of playing a role here. But in general, tariffs can cause disruptions.
The president said, Byron, that Harley-Davidson riders are going to have a problem with Harley-Davidson over this move. So which brand survives, Harley-Davidson or Trump, with those folks?
You don't do well betting against Trump these days, and I think he's probably right about Harley-Davidson riders who voted for Donald Trump. This does seem to be on Harley-Davidson's part, in part a reaction to these tariffs, but also part of a trend in the company to build more motorcycles overseas. They build them in Brazil, they build them in India, they build them in Thailand, they build them in Australia. So the idea that every Harley is built in the good old USA is actually just not correct. And the other thing that I've been thinking since this news happened was, does anybody think that this is the final act in this? I mean, these tariffs are very fluid. Most of them haven't even taken effect yet. There are threats and counter threats. So I think we need to wait a while to see what happens.
That's what he said, patience, the other day.
Patience. Well, Harley does have a problem because it's not attracting younger riders so much anymore in the U.S., as Molly alluded to. I think the president, I had a hard time figuring out what he was talking about with the taxes that are coming and the this and the that. But it's extraordinary the degree to which this businessman, Republican, believes that the way America should be run is that private businesses should be ordered around by the White House and told whether they're investing in the right place or not.
And calls them out.
And threatens them with all kinds of retaliation. You know, whether this decision by Harley was or was not precisely because of the tariffs, it's certainly the fact that Trump put in the tariffs. The tariffs are the big thing that's changed in the global economy. So he better get used to people blaming his tariffs for their decisions because he did it. And, you know, if he doesn't like that, maybe he ought to consider that that is part of the political price of being the one guy in the whole world who is insisting on raising tariffs all over the place.
Now, the president points back to the G7 where he said, okay, let's do no tariffs across the board to all the countries. And he says, nobody said yes. And he said, wait a minute, folks, let's do nothing.
Yeah, he did advocate. It is interesting that he seems to claim that he's doing these tariffs as a way to get to lower tariffs. And it is important to remember that it's not like we were in a free trade utopia and then Trump came in and all of a sudden tariffs arrived. We have these complex agreements between different countries on all sorts of different products. There's nothing inherently wrong with renegotiating. There's nothing inherently wrong with saying, we think your tariffs are too high, so we're going to start telling you to stop bullying us. But also it's true that Canada just imposed steel tariffs on China today. And so to say that it's just Trump who's doing this is untrue. There are people who are advocating tariffs all across the board.
Byron, quickly, I want to just get into this other topic. Last night, the president said that maybe the U.S. should pay what Germany pays to NATO, and that is a smaller percentage of a smaller GDP. In other words, roll back what we pay to NATO.
Right. I mean, this is something he's been pushing since the campaign, and certainly since he became president. He actually went over to NATO headquarters and told everybody to pay more. You know, you got to pay more. So this is entirely consistent with what he has been saying, and we've had sort of ceremonial statements by people in NATO pledging to do more, and clearly Trump is trying to push him even harder.
We will follow it when we come back. A hero story.